Hi everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. I'm Frater Eleftheria, and today I'm going to be talking about another key concept in the Kabbalah, that is the concept of the two pillars. The two pillars can be understood as divisions of the tree of life. There's one pillar on one side and one pillar on the other, and different spheres of the tree of life grouped into each of those two pillars. They represent different divisions in the universe in terms of duality. They also represent different approaches to life, our relationships with other people. And the lesson really in the two pillars is the importance in finding the balance. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And if you want to check out my more introductory videos on the Kabbalah discussing the tree of life before you watch this one, I will link that playlist in the description below. So what are the two pillars exactly? In the Kabbalah, the two pillars are known as mercy and severity. And the name of each of those pillars is also related to a name of the sephirah that appears in the center of each of those pillars. So mercy is, of course, chesed, and severity relates to Geburah, which is likewise about severity, about justice, about strength. In addition, there is also said to be a third pillar on the tree of life, which is grouping the remaining four spheres on the tree of life, going down the middle. And this is the middle pillar, representing balance and equilibrium. In more recent times, there has been the middle pillar ritual devised to channel the balancing energies of this part of the tree of life. But traditionally, there was just the two pillars, and the concept involved two pillars and the relationship between them and the polarity between them. So the tree of life is divided into these two columns of sephirah. Why are they referred to as pillars? Where does this concept of the pillars come from? Well, we can see it if we have a look into the Old Testament. When King Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem, one of the features of the architecture of the temple was that at the entrance to the temple, there were two pillars standing either side of the entranceway. And these pillars were known as Jachin and Boaz. Boaz, the name, means strength, and the name Jachin has a number of meanings. It can mean he establishes, but it can also be referring to thanks or graciousness. So we see with Boaz very strong kind of correlation with the pillar of severity, and Jachin similarly being very related to mercy. And one of the places in modern Western esotericism where Jachin and Boaz feature quite prominently is in Freemasonry. A lot of the mysteries of Masonry and the Masonic degrees are related to the architecture of the temple in Jerusalem and the spiritual significance of that as a blueprint of the universe, as well as a blueprint of the human individual, and how building the temple represents the perfection of the human being. And similar to the tree of life in a way. And at the entrance of a Masonic temple, they also have these same two pillars. And the two pillars in Freemasonry have a number of kind of connotations to them. They represent, in the most kind of immediate sense, entering into the path of spiritual self-development and refinement. And in a more mystical kind of cosmological sense, they represent the duality that is in the universe and the pairs of opposites that comprise the universe. Boaz is negative and Jachin is positive. So Boaz might represent darkness, the moon, the terrestrial realm, whereas Jachin represents the sun, the celestial realm, and the light, for example. And you can see the set of polarities created there. So in the Kabbalah, there is that kind of cosmological meaning behind the two pillars. You'll see that the three sets of sephirot on each of the pillars are kind of like polarities of each other. So you have the intellectual Hod complementing the more emotional Netzach, and then above that you have the more kind of restrictive and severe Geburah, complementing the more open and generous and expansive Chesed. And then at the top you've got the very kind of dark, saturnine sphere of Bina, complemented by Chokmah on the other side, which is much more kind of positive and life-giving. But additionally, in the Kabbalah, the two pillars are known as the pillars of justice. And the reason for this is that in order to have true justice, you need to have a balance or a combination of both mercy and severity. And this is the great wisdom of this teaching of the Kabbalah, of the two pillars. Because we often get tempted to think of, having any severity in a situation whatsoever is always bad. And there's even a school of thought in the Kabbalah that evil emanated from Geburah, the main sphere of the pillar of severity that gives rise to that energy of severity. And we often think of infinite mercy as kind of like an absolute good. Like the more mercy you add, the better it'll be. But in fact, if you have too much mercy, it can also be a bad thing that causes injustice. So the lesson of the two pillars of justice is that if you have strength without mercy, or if you have severity without mercy, the result is cruelty. But if you have mercy without severity, then you end up enabling evil. And we can understand this wisdom at a number of different levels. We can understand it in terms of the law of the land, the way that we apply or create laws in our own societies from day to day. It can be understood in terms of our personal relationships with other people. It can be understood in terms of God's plan. And it can also be understood in terms of the law of karma and what kinds of actions are likely to create karma. If we veer too far into an unbalanced way of life, in the way of one pillar or the other, we end up generating karma for ourselves. So this moral lesson of the Kabbalah, of the two pillars, is really quite invaluable, I think. And it is a way of showing the cosmic harmony and the balance between dualities in our everyday life and in the way that we run society. And so I want to use some examples to illustrate each side of the tree of life, each pillar, what mercy without severity might look like and what severity without mercy might look like. Because, we've got plenty of polarization to one extreme without the balance in our society. And we would do well to return to this kind of wisdom and base our society off of that, rather than the one-sided views that seem to prevail at the moment. So what are some examples of too much severity? Well, we can look at a number of things that government does and that legal systems do that fall into this category. In fact, most of the examples I use will be of this variety. But say, for example, somebody gets arrested for having certain illicit substances on them, not to sell, just for their own use, and this particular substance doesn't have that much negative impact and is in fact less harmful than some legal substances. Would it be fair for that person to be given a sentence where they have to go to prison for a number of years for possession of that substance? Is that a fair kind of consequence of that particular action, or is it a severe punishment that is overly cruel? We can see people who might have a chance at rehabilitation being put in a system that instead makes them more likely to reoffend, that turns them into lifelong criminals. And so ultimately, you're not solving a problem, you're just making it worse because you applied too much severity. And so there is an injustice that's happened there, not to mention, the civil rights of the individuals that are caught in that system. And similarly, a problem that occurs quite often here in Australia is that there are certain people who are born with fetal alcohol syndrome, and they get arrested for something, and they remain in police custody while they're awaiting a sentence. But because they're not fit to stand trial, they actually can't appear in court to argue their case, and so they end up being detained in custody for quite a long time, stuck in limbo, and sometimes the time that they spend in there is longer than the sentence that would have been handed down to them if they were found guilty. So that, again, is an unjust outcome, and it represents an excess of severity. Another example that comes up in international humanitarian law quite a bit is the disproportionate use of force to retaliate against an attack in the context of a war. And, we see examples of that in recent times as well. And, including from nations that should have this wisdom at the forefront of their mind, unfortunately, and seem to not have it. But that's the state of the world at the moment. All these kinds of examples of how severity without mercy leads to injustice. But what about the opposite side of the spectrum, which people don't often think of, particularly in the spiritual community where everything's love and light, and thinking positive thoughts all of the time, never being confrontational, etc., etc. Perhaps people haven't thought that, in fact, mercy without severity can be just as sinful as severity without mercy. So what are some examples of mercy without severity? Well, one that I'm sure will be very familiar to everyone is the kind of really misbehaving child that you encounter in a shopping centre or somewhere else in a public space, where the parent has absolutely no control over the child because they've tried their whole life to be the child's best friend, to apply a really gentle approach to parenting with no discipline, and never reprimanding them, never wanting to upset them when they've done something wrong. And so they create this little monster that just terrorizes the rest of society and grows up being very entitled and thinking that there are no consequences to their actions, even if they act in the most antisocial way they can imagine. This is a clear example of mercy without severity, which has dire consequences for the parents, for everybody who knows that child, and for society at large. And ultimately, you could prevent more damage to society and more harm done to a greater number of people if you just discipline the child and make them upset that you're telling them off for the sake of helping them learn how to act appropriately with other people. But you see here how severity superficially seems like a bad thing or a negative thing, but it actually serves a much greater good. And it's a form of tough love, and it's a way of maintaining justice and equilibrium in the broader society. Another example might be if you've ever been in a relationship, or any kind of relationship really, with a person who is a narcissist. You know that mercy is your worst enemy, because they will always want to overstep your boundaries. They will always want to manipulate. And if you let them back in again, they're just going to do the same thing again. So there are these certain toxic people who refuse to work on their own issues, who you just need to cut out of your life. And that seems severe, but if you've ever dealt with one of these people, you know that severity is the only option available to you, because they won't give you any other choice. They won't allow you to be restorative or to be patient or to be kind. They will only take advantage of that. So you need to apply severity with such people. And if you don't, you're teaching them that they can get away with those negative behaviors towards you. And one day, if they do leave your life, you might think that the problem is over, that you resolved your little conflict and everything's calm and peaceful, but they will then have learnt that the next relationship they get into, they can act the same way with other people. So you're actually doing the world a favour by applying severity to that relationship and letting them know that their actions have consequences. But I'm going to not just focus on the interpersonal here. I'm going to use an example from history, a well-known one, a perhaps infamous example, which shows that applying mercy without severity can have disastrous consequences for the entire world. When a certain mustachioed man came to power in Germany in the 1930s and started annexing parts of Europe and invading parts of Europe, the approach of the then British Prime Minister Chamberlain was one of appeasement, of just, if Germany takes as much land as it wants until it's satisfied and we let them, then they'll settle down when they get what they want, and we can make sure that Europe remains at peace. But of course, Germany didn't stop. And it wasn't until Churchill came along and applied severity that that evil was stopped in its tracks. So we can see here again that being overly merciful can have a heavy, heavy human cost, and that severity is, in some extreme circumstances, absolutely necessary. And as I said before, sin is going in one direction, in one extreme or the other. And if you look at the word sin, the true meaning of it is that it's missing the mark. That's what sin means. It means to miss the mark. It doesn't mean you've done something that you should feel dirty or ashamed or embarrassed about. It's that you tried to do something, but you weren't accurate in your actions landing in that sweet spot, which is the good. Kind of like if you think about the center of a target. If you're playing darts or you're an archer and you're trying to hit a target, it's a very specific point that you're trying to hit. And if you sway either side of that, then you've missed the mark. And so it's all about hitting the center. And again, with avoiding sin, one thing that we learn from the lesson of the two pillars is that, again, is about finding that center, finding the balance between mercy and severity, and not venturing into the sinful behavior that is in the extremes of either one of those pillars. So that is the lesson of the two pillars, and that is another introductory video on the concepts of the Kabbalah. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you did, please like the video, subscribe to my channel to support my work, and if you want to support me further, hit join or thanks down below. But thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.